Hi, this is Natalie Hoffman of FlyingFreeNow.com, and you're listening to the Flying Free Podcast, a support resource for women of faith looking for hope and healing from hidden emotional and spiritual abuse. In today's episode, we have the privilege of speaking with Bob Hamp, a licensed marriage and family therapist and author of several books, including Think Differently, Live Differently, Foundations of Freedom, and his newest release, Think Differently, Lead Differently. Bob and his wife, Polly, are the owners and directors of Think Differently Counseling, Coaching, and Connecting, which is a counseling and training center in Grapevine, Texas. Bob, welcome to the Flying Free Podcast.
Thank you, Natalie.
I first heard you speak on a Facebook Live event about a year ago on the subject of abuse, and it was one of the most insightful teachings I had ever heard. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you do on Facebook? It looks like you hold classes locally and then you offer them live. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, it depends. If you're asking or if my wife's asking, if my wife is asking, what I do on Facebook is I scroll and I hang out. What you're asking about is our counseling center is, as you mentioned, Think Differently Counseling, Coaching, and Connecting. And we have a Facebook page for that center. And the primary thing we do on that page is we use that for our Tuesday night classes, which we host them live here at the center. We have a small classroom here, and it's open to the local area, so people come in from all around here. But we also broadcast on Facebook Live a wide range of topics. And so it will be anything from spiritual growth and transformation, relational issues, and among that would be some of the teaching that I do on abuse that you've described, that is how you stumbled across our stuff. And so those Tuesday night classes are also mingled in with, we do a variety of events. And those events are also announced. And actually this next year, we're going to broadcast those events, not on the Facebook page, but on a separate site. But we'll communicate about that on the Facebook page.
That sounds fabulous. Because a lot of women that I've talked to a lot of women who don't have Facebook, or they don't go on Facebook. And some of them are on Facebook. They have to be careful about what they look at or read or like, because they're in these precarious situations with spouses who are kind of keeping an eye on them and controlling what they're doing. And so, they have to be careful. So that
Absolutely.
Sounds wonderful.
And there's a lot of people, just believe it or not, who just culturally aren't on Facebook. And so
I can't believe that.
Shocking, I know. So we, for that reason and several others, we're going to move over to another website. But Facebook is still kind of a central place for communication. And until further notice, those live classes are every Tuesday at 6:30. Other than the little break that I just told you about that we're doing during the holidays.
Okay. So as far as all the different subjects that you talk about, when you first started, was it just a year ago, or had you talked about abuse prior to? When was the first time you started talking about abuse a little bit?
Probably the one you're referring to. I taught the session a year ago fall, a 2-part series on the first one on understanding abuse, the second one on spiritual abuse. I've actually taught for probably a decade on spiritual abuse, just because it's so prevalent, and in the varying positions I've been in, I regularly encounter people who've been abused in churches by church leaders or by church institutions. Obviously, leaders are involved in that, but it's only probably been the last 2 years that I've been teaching on other forms of abuse.
Okay. And have you noticed that I think I had heard from you that when you did this teaching on abuse, that you had just tons of shares and there was a lot of activity, a flurry of activity.
So I like to think people like all the stuff we teach. And we really do. We've got a growing appreciative audience. But when we opened the door and started teaching on abuse, it's like everybody came out of hiding.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a fair way to say that or not, but the reaction was significantly higher and stays that way. It continues to be something that people just share regularly. And like you mentioned in our other conversation, I'm actually going to do a short ebook about that topic. Because what I believe is happening, Natalie, is that population who's been through, either is in the midst of an abusive relationship, or is getting out of, or has gotten out of that, has been a very isolated, silenced group. And much of that because of the very dynamics of abuse and the way that the rest of the world and the church world understands abuse. Often the people who have been victims and or have gotten out of an abuse relationship just kind of disappear from sight. And so it seems that when I've spoken for them, there just seems to be a real kind of gathering around that voice. I think it's also comparable to what's happening with the Me Too thing these days, that people are just finally feeling like somebody sees, somebody is going to give a voice to this, and I'm not alone.
Mm-hmm. I wish that you who are listening to this could have just heard. Bob just recorded a workshop that's going to be available within the Flying Free private membership group, and it was absolutely incredible. And I wish you could do the whole thing right here, but this is just a 30-minute podcast. Okay. But one of the questions that I wanted to ask you about was, my audience is women of faith. So women who have put their hope in Christ, they have invested their lives in their local churches. Many of them are very conservative. So they have had, some of them have lots of children. Many of them homeschooled, baked bread from scratch, the whole 9 yards. Okay. And then they wake up after 2 or 3 decades of their lives that have been poured into this relationship that has not worked. And it's overwhelming when they first wake up and realize and one of the things I want to say is the workshop that you just did is it's a way of seeing what abuse is that actually helps you wake up to it, really. Yeah. So, but the thing is they maybe aren't ready when they realize that they actually are in an abusive situation. They're not ready to pull the plug right away. Their first reaction is like their reaction all the time, which is, oh my word, I've got to fix this. Now I'm going to have to, dig down deep into whatever reserves I have left, which is pretty much nothing, and try to figure out how to fix what's now identified as an abusive relationship. But another thing is that they have children. A lot of them have children. They might be lots of different ages. Some of them have kids that are in their 20s and even 30s, but a lot of them have kids that are still teenagers and even younger kids. They have money situation that are financial considerations because they've been stay-at-home moms, a lot of them, and they don't have a career. They don't have a job. They laid all of that to the side in order to invest in this marriage and help, build up their husband and invest in their children. How would you advise them as far as what they could do in their current situation when they're first realizing what's going on, but they're not ready to pull the plug? How would you advise them to manage or to think about their situation with their abusive partner?
I think, let me step back and then answer that question. I'm going to give a little bit of context that's, I think, super important to this. One of the things that primary to emotional and mental health, and therefore spiritual maturity, is this movement from emotional dependence to emotional independence. Humans are supposed to move from when they're born and fully dependent on their parents to a place of emotional independence where they, as the Bible says, leave their mother and father and cleave to their spouse. And each generation is supposed to make that shift towards emotional independence. Emotional independence isn't the kind of rebellious independence that people are afraid of. Emotional independence is I think for myself. I manage my own life. I manage the world around me. I don't carry somebody else's burden when it's not mine. I do carry my burden so that other people don't have to. And it's a way of living free. So emotional independence is both psychologically and spiritually the key to health and freedom. And emotional independence also means learning to discern what am I responsible for and what is somebody else responsible for. And one of the things that I think is crucial to that, and Natalie, you've heard me describe and quoted in your book, that abuse at its root is an inappropriate assignment of responsibility. So it's tied to the struggle to make that leap to emotional and spiritual health of independence. In other words, if I'm responsible for myself and I'm not responsible for other people, then I can be spiritually and mentally healthy. But if I'm in an abuse dynamic, then what that means is I start to feel responsible for things that aren't mine. And often in control-oriented environments, whether it's a job or a religious setting, the same thing is true. In other words, control uses a variety of things like guilt and shame, and even will claim to be God's mouthpiece in order to get other people to feel a burden that is not necessarily their burden. And so all that to say, the number one thing I would say is really begin to understand what you're responsible for and what you're not responsible for. What God asks of us in relationships and what he doesn't. And begin to realize that in many cases, simply beginning to really manage your own internal world and stop trying to manage other people's internal world will change a number of things without ever changing your relational status. Now that was a lot to throw out there, but I wanted to tie this idea of overarching emotional and spiritual health to this idea that in settings where control or manipulation or domination are being used, whether it's abuse or whether it's simply institutional control, like what can happen in some religious settings, then the opportunity to say, wait a minute, well, God wants me to be in healthy relationships. He doesn't want me to be controlled by others, nor does he want me to control others, because that takes away the opportunity for genuine love. Allowing people the freedom to make choices, allowing people the freedom to think their own thoughts and even carry their own responsibilities is a tremendous act of love that some people don't actually want.
Yeah.
There's for some reason we seem to land here, so let me wrap this up by saying this. There's a moment in the Old Testament where you see that Israel goes to the prophet and says, hey, tell God that we want a king. And so the prophet comes back to God and says, the people want a king. And God says, tell them they can have one, which is scary that God's going to give them what they ask for. And he says, but if I give them a king, he's going to take your kids, he's going to take your land, he's going to take your money. And he goes through about 3 paragraphs of what the king will take away from people. Now, here's what I think that's a picture of. Everybody wants somebody else to be responsible for them. But that was never God's design. The reason that the Israelites wanted a king is the same reason that we often want to look to somebody else to tell us what to do and how to think. But when we're letting other people tell us that, instead of discerning that within a community, then we set up half of the control dynamic. So learning to really have your own relationship with God and learning to discern what you're responsible for and what you're not responsible for are actually the foundations of a lot of freedom, not just freedom from abuse.
Right. So if a woman, she sees the dynamic, she might even be tempted to take her notes to her spouse and go, hey, look, I learned this. I learned that, I was watching this Facebook video and by this guy named Bob Hamp. And
I'll give him my address also.
Right. And he described, and this is how he described the situation. And I'm really seeing this in our relationship. And I need you to take more responsibility. She's going to get kickback from her spouse, and it's probably going to blow up in her face. So what would you suggest that she do if she were to hear what you have shared? And by the way, I'll put links to some of his teachings on this that are on Facebook in the show notes so that you can link and listen to more of what he has to say, because he's got a lot of really great things that you guys are going to want to hear, but that we're not going to be able to cover in a little podcast. But how are they going to handle the kickback? How can they, there's a cycle, and you're familiar with this cycle. How do they change? What do they do to change it? And how do they handle the kickback that they're going to get when they do actually try to change what they would normally do in the cycle?
But I think you're wise to point out the cycle. And I think it's also a helpful aspect of really beginning to walk in freedom. I think the most important part is to learn what is your part of the cycle. And anything you do that's no longer playing your part of the cycle, when you describe they might be tempted to take it in there and have a conversation where you say, look, I now see that I'm being abused, or I now see that we're in a control subjection relationship. That might actually just feed the same cycle. Mm-hmm. So the wisdom to recognize that capitulating, passivity, taking care of the other person's needs without expecting them to respond to your needs, all of those are elements of that cycle. And I think probably more so than just going and having a confrontation, I would pick one or two things that you have never asked for before and just go ask. And the dilemma is, and I know that you know this, Natalie, some people are in dangerously abusive relationships. Some people are in control dynamics that both of them don't know better. And those who are in dangerous relationships need to not go provoke more anger or more abuse. But in any of those dynamics, it's safe, I believe, to be able to just walk up to your spouse and say, hey, I really need more of this. What would it take for me to have more of this? Whether it's more conversation, more affection, more respect, more honor, and if possible, describe those things in some behavioral ways. In other words, if you just say, it would really mean a lot to me if I had more honor, don't just say that. Say, what would it take for us to have a relationship where I feel more honored by you? For instance, you use a kinder tone with me, or you don't call me names, or give some specific behaviors that would indicate that shift. And then that it's a little bit like sticking your toes in the water when you do that.
Yeah.
I think we described in the class that we just had that, sometimes when you confront the abuse dynamic, it suddenly escalates. And the reason it escalates is because the dynamic assumes that the victim will remain passive. Mm-hmm. So to go from fully passive to fully confrontational might be like burning your house down.
Well, and when you ask for something, the other person thinks that you're implying that they haven't, that they have failed in some way, and then they don't like that because they are always right. They don't fail. They're perfect. So just even by making your needs known, you are almost kind of inviting a fight, and you don't mean to. It's like you really don't want to do that. You just want to have a meeting of the minds. You just want to have a connection. You want to hear their heart, and you want them to hear your heart, and it's just not possible. Is there ever a time when you just need to, it feels counterintuitive to just back off, because then for sure you can't. I mean, I guess I just remember thinking in my own relationship, well, if I don't keep trying, then I'm giving up, and I don't want to give up. I want this relationship to work. Is there ever a time where you just do need to give up and just kind of refocus your energies on, and what do you refocus your energy on?
So let me first of all say that the opposite of an abusive relationship is a mutual relationship. It's not the absence of abuse, it's the presence of mutuality. And so when two partners can meet each other in the middle and meet each other's needs in meaningful ways, you have a healthy relationship. So the answer to your question is, what I heard you just ask is there ever a time to give up?
Yeah.
Picture for just a minute, you've gone and you've asked, you've said, would it be possible for us to have a relationship where I get more honor from you? the first thing you're looking for, the first time you do that, it's like sticking your toes in the water and finding out what comes back.
Mm-hmm.
You took us from the beginning to the end then of that dynamic, which would be if you've asked a few times and change hasn't happened, the next step would be deciding how you're going to manage your own life. In other words, the way that Danny Silk in Keep Your Love On describes setting boundaries. Boundaries aren't telling the other person what to do. They're telling the other person what you're going to do.
Mm.
So it would be things like, hey, I've noticed that when I've asked for honor, it doesn't seem to come back to me. From now on, if you're not honoring to me, I'm going to not engage in a conversation that you're not honoring to me.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
so, again, keeping in mind safety issues. Not all relationships is it safe to do this. But setting a boundary isn't about telling the other person what they need to do. It's about telling them what you'll do if changes don't happen. And so you ask for what you need. And if they don't make those changes, then you follow through with, it can be things like, whatever you've provided in the relationship. It's not manipulative for you to say, look, I'm not comfortable being intimate with somebody who's cruel to me. I'm not, and by intimate, you're going to have to define, do you mean sexuality or do you just mean emotional connection? But whatever it is whatever boundary you're willing to set, you say, I'm not comfortable giving my heart to somebody who screams at me, or I'm not comfortable sharing connected times with somebody who's critical of me. If you're not willing to make that change, I'm going to distance myself a bit more and figure out what I need to be safe. If you're not going to help me be safe, then I'm going to get safe. So that's like a step 2. And then step 3 would be, I think, the thing you're asking about, which is at some point, if you've asked for change and it hasn't happened, and then you've made some changes that you're making in order to make sure that you're safe, provided for, cared for, whatever it is you're needing, and they either escalate, and by the way, that would be one sign that it might be time to consider. When you said, is there a time to give up? If they escalate when you ask for your needs to be met, that's a pretty good sign that somewhere out there you're going to need to say, if this keeps escalating, you don't want to keep feeding an ongoing escalation.
Mm-hmm.
It's one thing to not get what you need. It's another thing to escalate things. And if you're escalating things, stop right then.
Mm-hmm.
If at some point it continues and they don't respond in meaningful ways to your needs, and again, there's so many directions to this. It's hard to speak in generalities about it because for one person, what I need might be, just some time together in the evening after the kids go to bed. For another person, it might be, I need you to not hit me anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the time to give up, and I'm going to go back to the resource that I quoted in our session, Beyond Boundaries by Cloud and Townsend, talks about the difference between hurt and harm. And what they say is that we hurt each other in relationships regularly. I mean, it's part of being close. Sometimes someone misunderstands. Sometimes somebody has a bad day and says something. We hurt each other, and that's not unusual. But harm is when it starts to really affect you detrimentally in your mental and emotional state or in your ability to perform in day-to-day life.
Yeah.
So if what you're asking for, or if you're asking them to stop something and they're not stopping, begins to harm you, at that point, it's time to ask yourself the question, is it reasonable that it might change someday, or has all of their behavior pointed out that perhaps change is inevitable and I'm just way too optimistic, or change is not going to be inevitable. Sorry, I said that backwards. And then here's the other thing I would add to that, Natalie. I think this is really a crucial piece of this. I've been a counselor since 1991. I've been a licensed counselor since 1991. And actually 93, sorry. I got my degree in 91, got my license in 93. I don't think I really understood personality disorders until the last 6 years.
Mm.
And I think that if you are in an abusive relationship, I think it would be important for you to begin to learn about personality disorders. And the reason I say that is because if you're just working through conflict, then work hard and be patient. But if you're dealing with somebody who shows a strong likelihood that they have a personality disorder, your hard work might actually be fueling the pain that's coming back at you.
Right.
So in short, what I tell people who are in here and trying to work through a relationship issue, and I spot what I think might be a personality disorder, what I tell them is that in the DSM-5, which is the book that we use to diagnose psychiatric disorders, 98% of what's in that book is what's called acute disorders that can be treated in a variety of different ways. 2% are what's called the axis 2 or personality disorders, which the American Psychiatric Association would say those are not something that's treatable. They're by personality disorder, something that took place in the formation of personality in the early years of life, and therefore is kind of cemented in as a natural part of their character. In fact, some people use the term character disorders instead of personality disorders to describe the axis 2 disorders. And if you're married to somebody or in a relationship with somebody who has a personality disorder that seems to be identifiable, that itself might be a sign that it's time to really change your tactics or even consider backing out of continuing to try.
Right. Okay. So what if you, in Christian circles, there's a lot of spiritual teaching that actually feeds into the abuse dynamic. So a Christian woman, for example, she wouldn't necessarily feel like she has the right to ask to have her needs met because, Jesus is supposed to meet all your needs. Or maybe when she starts setting some boundaries or making her needs known, she's accused of being selfish or demanding or accused of even giving, you're giving up on the relationship. But maybe if she starts to create some distance and protect herself, or she'll be told, you have an anger problem, you're bitter. And then usually what I've seen in so many cases is that the church tends to come alongside of the abusive person who won't take the responsibility, and they actually kind of coddle that person and join that person in criticizing and shaming and blaming the victim. It's like abuse round 2, only more intense, because now you don't just have a private situation going on. Now you've got kind of a public smear campaign happening. How do these women deal with that? How are they supposed to think about that?
Well, we talked about in the class that we just did together, you and I talked about really counting the cost. And part of that is if you really start to realize that you're in an abuse situation, it's not going to change. What Natalie just described about the common reaction that in many church settings, because of the misunderstanding of what abuse really is and how it operates, you'll want to know ahead of time that the cost of leaving a relationship like that is more than just leaving the relationship, that it may affect other relationships in your life as well. And in fact, probably will affect in meaningful ways your church relationship. And it's one of the reasons I started the conversation talking about the importance of emotional independence, to realize that it may be the most individual decision you've ever made if you decide to get out of that relationship. Well, let's talk for a minute about what you just described, and that is, when people start to talk about it, there's kind of this picture of men and women and the difference between what they're allowed and all those kind of things. Galatians 5 talks about, it's the verse that talks about submit yourselves to your husband. And that verse is A, quoted so out of context, and B, so misunderstood that and many other verses set up the dynamic you're talking about. If you take that verse just by itself and say, wives, submit yourselves to your husband, and don't recognize that there's a difference between the words submit and subject, then what you end up with is a mindset that says, wives, subject yourselves to your husband, which means allow yourself to be controlled by. Submit means choose to give yourself to. Now, here's the dilemma with that is, if you're going to give yourself, but you're only being part of yourself, you're not actually giving yourself, you're hiding part of you. In other words, part of what you described a minute ago, when women might be asked to be less or to endure certain things, The idea of submitting yourself presumes that you're bringing your whole self to that relationship, not a fragment of yourself, not just the servant part of yourself, but all of yourself, your needs, your desires, your dreams, your hopes. And you're giving your husband your needs, your hopes, your dreams, and your desires. And then you have to put that in context, because it first of all says, give yourselves one to another in love. Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands. Husbands, love your wife as Christ loved the church. And it's really just one concept with two examples. The concept is give yourselves one to another in love. The examples are husbands, wives, submit to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Think about the way that Christ loved the church. Christ loved the church by laying his life down for her. More than that, by giving her back her identity, by giving her back her strength, by giving her back her life. Jesus came not to take from the church and demand servitude. In fact, think about what he said in the book of Matthew. He said, the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. And so that would actually reverse the idea that if in the marriage dynamic, one person would serve the other, it would be the husband, not the wife. But go back to what I said a minute ago. A healthy relationship, the opposite of abuse, is a mutual relationship. There's mutual servitude. There's mutual strength of identity. There's mutual meeting of one another's needs. If you've grown up in a faith stream that says a woman's needs are to be set aside for the man's, I would ask yourself the question, A, is that a family of origin belief, or is that a biblical belief?
Mm.
Often what happens is generations and culture pass things on as if they're scripture, as opposed to really going back to the scripture itself, separate of cultural interpretations. And so when you have patriarchal cultures who have allowed the men to dominate, and obviously back in the ancient cultures, men were the economic strength, women were considered as property, all those kind of things. And so you have these cultural dynamics where women are subservient. But I think you'd be hard-pressed to find that in scripture if you think differently about the word submit. And a number of other places where the scripture describes the relationship between men and women. If you think about the life of Jesus and the way that he empowered women, there were a number of women that followed him. Even in the Paul's letters to the churches, you see that there were women serving in positions of meaningful leadership. And so I think there's Jesus actually in many ways reversed the culture of his day that allowed that for the subjection of women, and he actually gave women a much more powerful place in his disciples' roles. So I think it's important to look at that idea through a lens that's not just cultural, but one that's step outside of that. But then ask the question: if I'm going to give myself to my husband, would I allow him to do things that are harmful to himself? If I'm going to give myself to him, does that mean I'm just going to be silent while I watch him do things that harm himself, the kids, and the family? Or does that mean I'm going to give all of myself to him and share the part of me that could also possibly prevent that harm?
Right. Even if it doesn't work, because we're supposed to do what's right, whether or not it actually ends up with the result that we want to have. We still do what's right. And then we leave the result in faith to God.
Right.
And sometimes the result, especially when you're dealing with an abusive person, more often than not, you don't get the result that you're looking for. And to that point, though, I'm wondering if before we close, if you could give, in the workshop that you just did, you talked about some things to look for, some really important things to look for, if you want to be able to tell or discern if there really has been some genuine inner change in your partner. And what can you just talk a little bit about those things? Because that's a huge thing. A lot of times women, they really want to see change. They're grasping at straws. Well, and of course, the abusive partner is saying, well, I've changed. Look I've done A, B, C, and D, all the things that were on your list. I've changed. And yet the woman is still feeling like, I just don't know. There's something not right.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I'd love to, and in fact, to do that, let me say, let me just quickly give the concept of abuse as we described it in that class. That abuse is that inappropriate assignment of responsibility, and that's why submission actually means being yourself in the relationship and not letting the other person take away your place in the world. And by an inappropriate assignment of responsibility, somebody who's angry makes everybody else responsible for their anger. Somebody who's sexually abusive makes other people responsible for their sexual needs. But then they move beyond that and they also blame the other people for their misbehavior. So the role that an abuser plays in that dynamic is they look to the world around them to tell them that they're okay, to make them feel better about themselves, or to pay the price if they don't feel good about themselves. That's important because if we're going to talk about what really is an indicator of change, we need to understand what it is that's supposed to be changing. Because the abuser is typically thinking, there's a behavior I do that I should stop, or there's a behavior that I do that other people make me do it. It's, I wish they wouldn't make me do it. However they think of that. So what people think is, well, if they stop being violent, if they stop sleeping with other people, if they stop cursing out their spouse or their kids, then they will have changed. But the reality is, if they don't shift to the place where they take responsibility for themselves, the real issue that needs to change isn't even being considered. And so the things I talked about were, first and foremost, empathy. That the abuser who can't express empathy hasn't even understood what it is they're repenting from. In other words, empathy is the understanding and the expression of what it was like to be you in relationship to me. So empathy would be, I now see how you have been in pain and what it's like to be and what you've experienced in relationship to me. And not only do I understand it, I'm going to express it to you until you feel like I understand it. Number two is responsibility. Responsibility is, I made choices, I did some things, my choices and my actions harmed you, and it was my responsibility and mine alone. Think about what we said a minute ago. Abuse is the inappropriate assignment of responsibility. So unless the abuser takes responsibility and admits responsibility, again, in an ongoing way, then there's not real change. So because empathy and responsibility are the two key things, then there's two key qualifiers that need to be with that. Number one, they if they need to be validated for that, then it's not real change. In other words, empathy and responsibility would say, I did this and you've been in pain. It wouldn't say, don't you notice how much I've changed? How come you don't validate my change? How come you won't give me credit for what I have done? In other words, the inability to take responsibility says you still have to validate me.
Right.
If I've changed, quote unquote, then you have to live with me in such a way to say that I've changed so that I feel good about the change that I've done. So the first thing, the first qualifier is that the abuser should not need to be validated by anybody else. Their expectation that other people will recognize their change is still a sign of not changing. And then the second qualifier is time. Because the abuser wants to adjust behavior instead of connection, they want to change behavior instead of responsibility taking, they'll adjust their behavior. But in the overall cycle of abuse, there's a part of the cycle that is when the abuser changes behavior long enough to guilt the victim of abuse back into the abuse cycle. And so they'll change behavior and they'll advertise to the world, look how changed I am. And then the victim will say, well, the first two times they'll say, wow, you've really changed. I'm going to come back. The third time they'll say, hey, I've bit on this bait before, but now all my friends are pressuring me and saying, don't you see how repentant he is? You should go back to him. But that part of the cycle where changing behavior is part of the abuse cycle, if that change doesn't maintain over at least 3 months, and by that change, I mean empathy and responsibility that are expressed, if that change doesn't remain over at least 3 months, I would not consider it legitimate change.
Good. So if your partner says to you, I take responsibility for what I've done, but you also have played a part and you need to take responsibility.
Once they say the word but, they've negated everything they say.
Exactly.
If you're taking responsibility, there is no but. It's I'm taking responsibility, period.
Yes.
So
what if it's I'm taking responsibility and you need to also take responsibility?
And that is a form of blame.
Yes.
Most of the time, the victim of abuse has already been taking too much responsibility.
Right.
And it fits the thing that I described in that class where I said, a control freak experiences other people as controlling because they believe they own everything.
Yeah.
And when another person starts to reclaim their own soul and the control person believes they had the right to that, they feel controlled when you start to take your own life back.
Yep. Oh, so this is good stuff.
The idea that I've taken responsibility, but you have to too. A third party should be the one to say that, not the offender.
Yeah.
If a counselor says that, all power to them. But if the offender says it, it's just completely undermined any sense that they've actually taken responsibility.
Yep. They still don't get it. They still don't get it.
Exactly.
Okay, this has been really, really good. I'm so thankful that you were willing to do this, and I know you're busy. We're recording this during the holidays, and I'm just grateful for your time. And that's it.
Well, you're very welcome. The timing was actually perfect, so I'm grateful.
Well, that must have been that was God then. All right. Well, thank you so much. And the rest of you, thank you for joining us. And I hope that you will subscribe. This is a brand new podcast. And so make sure that you subscribe so that you won't miss future interviews and future episodes. There's lots of stuff, like I've told you before, said in the first episode, I've got a list a mile long of some great subjects that we're going to be talking about here. So thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you next time.